Nintendo's consoles get hacked way more consistently than Microsoft's or Sony's, and the Switch is no exception. And while the Xbox and PlayStation usually do get hacked, it happens after the console is discontinued, and usually requires modification to the hardware inside, like on the Xbox 360. This is how the Nintendo Switch got hacked, who was involved, and how Nintendo responded. Before anything had even happened, Nintendo had implemented more security to the Switch to prevent or make it more difficult for people to hack it. An example is the prevention of downgrading. Every time you go and update the Nintendo Switch through system settings, the Nintendo Switch's processor, the NVIDIA Tegra X1, will burn a fuse and essentially make it impossible to downgrade. To be more specific, when the Nintendo Switch boots, it checks for a number of burnt fuses, and if the number of burnt fuses is higher than expected for the firmware version you're on, the Switch won't boot. Nintendo doesn't want people to downgrade to, for example, take advantage of a software exploit discovered on an older version, which is what happened with the 3DS. However, this same processor would also be the reason the Switch got hacked. Barely 1 year after the Nintendo Switch had released, a hacker named Catherine Temkin, with the group Reswitched, disclosed to the public that they discovered a massive vulnerability with the Nintendo Switch, named the Fusée Gelée exploit. This exploit targeted the boot ROM, a piece of read-only memory inside the processor that contains the very first code that is executed when you turn on the Switch, or any device with that processor. An exploit like this is very powerful. It allows hackers to load their own code before anything else is loaded, most importantly before securities have been enabled. You access this exploit through the Tegra X1's USB recovery mode, which I will reference as RCM mode from this point onwards. Usually, to boot into RCM mode, you have to open up the Switch. However, you can force it to boot into RCM mode by shorting a pin on the right Joy-Con connector on the Switch. This led to the development of what are being called RCM jigs, which you can slide down the right Joy-Con rail on the Switch to short out these pins easily. After the pin had been shorted, and after pressing the volume up and power button for around a second, boom, you have booted into RCM mode. However, we're not running custom code yet. Once booted into RCM mode, you need to plug a USB cable into the Switch from a computer, or any device that can do the following. To spare you from the technical things, basically, the computer or device sends a bad length argument to the Switch, which causes it to be overwhelmed with information, and from this overwhelmed point, allows custom code to be executed. People who hack game consoles usually do it for fun and just to experiment with the hardware. People have been running Android and Linux on the Switch, getting it to run emulators and cool homebrew apps made by the community. They just want to see what it's capable of. However, there is also a darker side to the hacking community. Temkin said that she publicized this now because of, quote, the potential for a lot of bad to be done by any parties who independently discover these vulnerabilities. Someone else did discover it and was going to release it prior to the Team Reswitched release. Not only that, but their intentions were different than Team Reswitched. Team Executor, a hacking group known for piracy, was planning to release their version of this. Unlike Team Reswitched, their goal was, for $30 or so, to enable piracy on the Nintendo Switch, and they were very upfront about it. They were also, unlike Reswitched, selling access to their custom firmware and profiting from piracy. Most hackers are against piracy, however. What makes this whole exploit such a big deal is that it's a hardware flaw, meaning that it cannot be simply patched out through a software update, or even if someone wanted to open the Switch up and fix it, they couldn't. The boot ROM cannot be modified after the Switch leaves the factory, hence read-only in its name, essentially making it impossible to patch out these vulnerable units. This did not stop Nintendo from attempting to fix it to their best ability. In the summer of 2018, Nintendo silently released a revision to the Switch. The only change visible to the consumer, observant consumer I might add, was a redesigned box. Some other changes that weren't so easy to spot but still noticeable were longer battery life and more accurate colors on the display. A change that wasn't visible to the consumer was a new Tegra X1 chip with a modified boot ROM that was patched from this exploit, meaning running custom code on these new units is currently impossible unless the new vulnerability is discovered. Nintendo also started, with no justification, banning any and every Switch that it detected was running custom firmware. Whether you were cheating in online games or not, you could be banned. I say could because it's really inconsistent with who gets banned and who doesn't. Nintendo was definitely more strict with the Switch compared to their other consoles though. They have also tried to patch the ability to run custom firmware through software updates, but the new updates were easily conquered by hackers since this issue is a hardware flaw. The problem with this being a hardware flaw is that you would have to boot the console into RCM mode and then plug a computer into it and then send your custom code to it every single time the console restarted, whether it died or crashed or whatever. That's pretty much all of the main events that happened with the Switch hacking scene. Team Reswitch's custom firmware, which is now being called Atmosphere, was released on time. And so was Team Executor's custom firmware, except Team Executor didn't have a smoother ride as Reswitched. Last year, the Department of Justice arrested 2 leaders of Team Executor, and they also charged 1 other person alleged to be involved with them. It's pretty safe to say that Team Executor has reached the end of the road, as their websites have been down for quite some time, and an update to their custom firmware hasn't been released in months. That's most of the big events that have happened in the Switch hacking scene so far. This story is definitely not over yet, as the Nintendo Switch is only around halfway through its life. That's all from me this time. Thanks for watching.